Hi, everyone. My name's Sam, and here we have Zevi, who runs the Seekers of Unity podcast. He can introduce himself from here.
Hey, I'm Zevi. I do run the Seekers of Unity podcast and YouTube channel, and I love thinking about and talking about philosophy and mysticism, and thinking about ways that we can bring philosophical mysticism into our lives to enrich our lived experience and to help us create a world that's kinder and warmer and more intimate.
That's awesome. I remember watching one of your episodes recently where you discuss how the Seekers of Unity podcast is like about bringing all different religions and mysticisms together into some sort of vision of a connected world. And I was curious when I heard that, what your vision more broadly would be. Like how would that look in the world if more people adopted that, if not to misrepresent you, but meta-mystical or whatnot perspective?
I like that. I like meta-mystical. I might start using that. I think what it might look like, yeah, my approach has been very much through trying to unite religious people and people that have affiliation with religious traditions by looking at the mystical core of each tradition and seeing the mystical core of religions as sharing a deep amount of commonality and unity between them. That's kind of the approach I've taken. I
Mhm.
I think that what's really important to me is that people don't abandon their particular forms of religiosity. There's been previous attempts to do this kind of meta-religious thing where it
Mm.
meant like letting go of your tradition and coming to some sort of shared, you know, sort of watered down universal thing. And that's really not, I think that's really not the way forward. I think it's about each one of us practicing our own traditions, our own culture, our own heritage in the richest of ways. And at the depth of that, finding a common language with which we can unite our yearnings and seekings for the divine together.
Okay, that makes sense. And I know you've made videos on Carl Jung. I don't know if you've made any on like Ken Wilber or other like sort of meta mystical kinds of thinkers, but I wonder, do you think that they're on the right track with their views on synthesizing different traditions, or do you think that that's leading people to alienate their traditions? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't made any videos directly about Ken Wilber, although he's popped up in, conversations of theory of mysticism and history of mysticism, particularly around meta-mysticism or what many people refer to as perennialism. It would be fun to do like a more in-depth exploration of his work. I think Ken is one of those real like generational geniuses that try to synthesize a tremendous amount of material. And for some people, that synthetic project is very beautiful and works well, and for others, it's too big. It's like
Hmm.
trying to include too much all at once without doing proper respect to the sort of piecemeal attention that each aspect of that synthesis demands of us. Um, it's also hard. It's hard to speak about, a philosopher who's still alive and producing. I think it takes time to see the fruits of their labor, only years after they pass on from this world. And I think only really time will tell about specific thinkers, what it is that they gave birth to, and what it is that we were able to take from the tremendous amount of work that they put into the field.
Hmm.
I myself, yeah, my feeling might be on kind of one foot is that I'm trying to approach this with a bit more attunement to the particularity. Um, maybe to some extent in theory, but more so in practice. Like I
Mm.
really do think it's really important, as you said, that people be really rooted in a particular practice. And I think sometimes people get like too enlightened for their own good, and they think that like they don't need any practice or any routine and ritual. And I think a community, and I think those things are all really important. I think they evolved together with us, and we evolved through them. And it's to our detriment that we become too heady and move into sort of too many grand theories, and we forget that we're actually here in bodies, and bodies are always particular and need particular ways of practicing and showing up and embodying the wisdom that we're trying to inculcate.
And that's your part of your inspiration probably for your series on prayer and helping people understand that better. Is that correct?
Certainly, yeah. I think there's a lot within religion that gets misunderstood and needs to be kind of reinterpreted through the lenses of mysticism, and then through the lenses of like a meta-mysticism. And I was trying to do that to some degree with the work on prayer. Prayer is one of those things that can get sort of thrown away, like tossed aside the baby in the bathwater, in a rush to, like, enlightenment or something. And I think it's really important to hold on to these really rich contemplative, monastic, or just religious practices that we've been cultivating for millennia.
Sure. How do you think how has prayer helped your mind and your connection to God, and how have you seen it affect other people when they take it more seriously?
Yeah, prayer really, in my tradition, which is the Hasidic tradition, prayer really is the place where we do come and connect with God. Prayer is a place of intimacy. There's kind of two like modes or mediums that we become intimate with the divine, and that is through Torah study, and through prayer. And those are sort of the two, at least internal. There's also ways that we unite to God through external activity, through acts of goodness and kindness. But in terms of just honing in inside oneself to connect to God, it's through prayer and study. And those are both seen as acts of mystical union. And I mean, to put it in a bit more practical, sort of down to earth language, it's in prayer that I do feel that sense of closeness and presence and intimacy of the divine in my life. I feel it gives me the space to step out of a crazy, busy, like overstimulated world, and to really center in to what it is that I'm trying to achieve here in this lifetime, and to do that, multiple times a day, to touch base, to ground myself again, in my relationship with God. And for me, it's brought a tremendous amount of calm and direction, and struggle. Sometimes prayer isn't simple. We sometimes we try showing up and we're not able to, or we reach out and we don't feel like God is there with us, whatever that means for us on the day. It can be a struggle, like hide and seek sometimes. But I've seen, both myself and for others, that prayer is a way to use the language of my tradition, to take the ideas that are filling our head, good ideas, let's say, but they can sometimes get stuck in the neck, because the neck is narrower than the head is the kind of metaphor that's used in the Hasidic texts. And prayer is slowly allowing it to trickle down from the brain into the heart. And that's the, according to the Sefirot, that's the Sefirah of Dat, of contemplation, of internalization, of embodiment. And prayer is where that all takes place. Or else we get stuck in, from the Hasidic perspective, we get stuck just in talk and ideas and words, and it never makes its way down into the body.
Wow, that's very deep. So you mentioned that you use it to help you get to where you want to go and to try and experience the most you can in this lifetime, right? I was curious, what would be your, right now, what could you see yourself achieving? What's your goals for this lifetime, as you said it?
That's a great question. Yeah, I want to add to that, because
Sure.
there is like an instrumental element where prayer is trying to affect something, but prayer, I also want to say, is an ends in itself. That prayer from a very important perspective is not trying to achieve anything. It's a mode of being in prayer, and that's both verbal prayer or mental prayer or silent prayer, or just prayerful state of being. It's like, if you ask someone, why do you spend time being intimate with your loved ones, with your partners, with your children? And the answer is not, because sometimes it's, because I want to work on my relationship, because I want to be close to them, whatever it is. But a truer answer might just be because that's the most beautiful thing that I can imagine doing, is like spending close time with people that I love. And prayer also has that sense of being an ultimate end in itself. But insofar as prayer is also used as a mode of dropping in, of tapping in, of aligning, What I am trying to ultimately achieve in this here lifetime is a mission which was given to me by my rabbi, by my guru, my spiritual teacher and father, the
Mm,
Lubavitcher Rebbe, the seventh Rebbe, and that is to take this world from a place that seems like an arbitrary, capricious, cold, heartless jungle, and turn it instead into a garden for God, a garden for humanity to live in harmony and in peace and in love and in kindness, cohesion with one another, to usher in, what the Jewish prophets and mystics refer to as the Messianic age. That's to me, that's the only thing that I aim for, and that's the only thing that I've been
mm,
taught to aim for. And to me, that's a very it's not necessarily it's framed sometimes in mythological and in sometimes supernatural language, but I don't think it has to be. I think it's very real and very realistic, and I think
mhm,
that we can strive towards there. And a lot of the literature of Jewish mysticism, Hasidic mysticism, is spelling out what that means, what that goal entails, and how we move towards it. So the simple, grandiose answer to what I'm trying to do here is to try to bring Mashiach, to try and usher us into a messianic age,
mm.
to do my small part in doing that, and to play my own redemptive role in that broader process.
Well, that's very awesome that you have such hope for the future. And I was curious after you said that, like how does your meta-mysticism project fit into like what you think is the best future for all people? Like, do you think if there were leaders who understood the kind of knowledge that you're talking about, that it would help create a more peaceful world? And if leaders accepted that kind of like knowledge and understood it themselves, what do you think it would manifest? Uh,
Yeah. So I'm trying to. I think part of this next, like awakening, or this next the redemptive period is moving away from a model of like needing leaders to lead us into a redemptive space. And I think that part of it is realizing that we're all leaders and we all have the power to take autonomy and agency in our own lives, and to lead our lives to a redemptive place, a redeemed place. And I think it's really about every single person. And now it's very much the message that I received when I,
mhm,
as a child. And what I think it practically means is that the mystics had a story, and the story was that although we live in a world which seems to be separate and alienated and 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 isolated from one another in our experience of reality, that there's a deeper, truer reality in which we're fundamentally one with one another, and we're one with all that is, and that's the experience which they called divinity, is feeling that unity of being. And I think today science has the same understanding of reality in many ways, and I think today psychology also. I mean, I think the depth of religion meets up very beautifully with the depth of science, the depth of psychology, the depth of really any field, the depths of mathematics. They all, to me, seem to be pointing in the same direction.
right.
And to me, the meta-mysticism is about seeing that story being told by the mystics and philosophers and scientists and psychologists throughout the ages, and understanding what it means to actually live that story in a way that's realistic and pragmatic and practical and rational. And to me, that's the most beautiful story. And to me, if we're able to shift our perspective, where we're no longer living in isolation from the rest of reality, but we are one with reality. We are reality in the form of Sam, in the form of Zevi, and we're not
Mm,
separate from one another. And therefore, your concerns and your success um, are my concerns and my success, and your pain and your loss is my pain and my loss. And I think
right.
that when we're able to shift into that mindset away from a state of egoic separation, then we're able to move into a redemptive state, described by the mystics of every tradition. That's on one foot the idea.
Right. Well, that's great. It's I agree with you that if people understood their connections and their relationships as being inseparable from one another, people would understand the deeper reality of like how things operate and just relate to each other in like the world in a way that's better, and also that's just how it always is, you
Yes.
know.
Yeah.
Uh, and I just wonder, like, so like, in order for there to be like I guess a society led in that kind of way, you need people who have power would probably have to understand these things from like the depths of themselves, don't you think? Like it, like, or would it, do you think it would, like, if there were a leader who totally like repress these kinds of things like they have historically at times, uh like I just wonder which is comes first, like the chicken or the egg, like uh
My personal feeling,
mhm,
and maybe this is just me speaking from my own generational vantage point, is that
right.
we have to stop waiting for leaders, for great men to come and save us and come and shape history. I think that I think that the people that have the power are the people. Each one of us has a tremendous amount of power, and when we can recognize the power that we have in reshaping our own lives and realities and our own relationships, and living in ways that are aligned with that understanding of reality, a reality that's deeply interconnected and interdependent in loving and caring ways, then we begin to shape the ground. We begin to shape the world bottom up. And
Hmm.
I don't think there's anything more powerful than that. And I think that we've seen the demonstration of the power of the masses. I think that we no longer live in, a feudal or in a monarchical age where we're under we live in a radically, in some ways, free and democratic age,
Hmm.
where the people, and that's both in a corporate sense and in a political sense and in a religious sense, where the people, we have the capacity to shape our own destinies. And I don't think we need to be held, we need to wait for it, and I don't think we can be held back by anyone. I
Hmm.
think if we really want it, each one of us can make it happen, first in our own lives, in our own friendships and families and communities, and then that ripples out to, to our cities and countries in the world.
Well, that's, I agree with that. I do. I guess you also would have to have the structure of the government be, um, like, to the best extent possible, put the people who are the best in leaders of that kind, like that understand these things, and have people who understand it and elect them, right? Because in order for it to be a democratic society, I guess they'd have to also understand it themselves, right? Uh,
I think that will happen naturally, and I think that, let's say, take America for example, where we're speaking right
mhm,
now. Um, we live in a country which is, at least on principle, is for the people and by the people, and I think that there's deep roots of a capacity for an enlightened form of governance, which may have been very much in line with what the founding fathers wanted, and what the, founding American spiritual intellectuals like the Transcendentalists, Thoreau and Emerson,
right.
prophesized. I think it's entirely possible. I'm not much of a politically minded person, and I kind of try to avoid politics. I leave it to the people who understand it better than I do. But my understanding is that politics follows the people, and there's a lot of factors and a lot of influences that go into it. And I don't want to be naive or simplistic or too idealistic about it. But I think at the end of the day, politicians are there as puppets of the public imagination, and they're acting out what they believe to be in the best interests, or what will at least get them in office, following the best interests of the people. There's a line from, I
Mm,
can't remember whose line it is, but he says that generals and politicians and ministers are all really just acting out the 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 poems of dead poets and philosophers that have
mm,
inspired the nations to the directions which they're looking to pursue. So in my humanistic mind,
mm,
politics follows downstream from the will of the people, and the will of the people is crafted by the narratives, by the stories that we tell ourselves, and that we use to continue to progress and evolve into, hopefully, ever more kinder and benevolent societies.
well, that's great. Yeah, I was just curious because I figured based on what you said, it's somewhat relevant to the whole manifestation of parts of your vision, long term, uh, because everyone exists in a macrocosm, and that's the society we live in. Um, and I had this question before we started that I've been thinking about this. It's sort of simple, and I figure you know the answer. Uh, like I was like in most traditions, right? They say like they associate climbing up or going up to the, like, that heaven's up, you know? Like I didn't really know why is like up considered like associated with the divine compared to down or sideways or like
Right,
slanted. I don't know.
right. That's a great question. Yeah. there's a very strong presence of directionality in world
Yeah.
theology, religion, mythology. A directionality which I think is like has good reason for being there, and also a directionality which I think sometimes is unhelpful.
Yeah.
I've often kind of pushed back against the language of up and transcendence, and because it carries along with it lots of subtle connotations.
Yeah.
There's an implicit, often patriarchal or at least masculinity to that notion,
Mm,
because it's linear, it's transcendent, it's erect. It's you could see how it shifts very quickly into those conceptions, where there are other conceptions in theology and metaphysics which are much more
mm,
circular, much more womb-like, as opposed to phallic, and those are kind of two poles that are used both in Jewish mysticism and other traditions. And
mm,
from those perspectives, we wouldn't speak about God as up; we would speak about God as surrounding or embracing,
mm.
or indwelling. These are more feminine depictions of divinity, which I think we may need as a corrective to the more masculine models that we've built up until now. There, I prefer to speak of God as that which is in the depth, the inward, as opposed to the out there, because the out there also alienates God. It puts God away
Right.
from us. I mean, there is something very powerful, no doubt, about looking up to the stars and that sense of awe and wonder that comes from staring out into the infinity of space. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, said that there's two things that forever stir his wonder: the moral law within and the starry sky above. There is certainly a
Mm,
sense where we look up and we try to understand, where we came from and how we got here. And a lot of theologies did develop with a model of divinity that is up and out there. In Plato's Republic, it's the
right.
philosopher mystic who climbs out of the cave towards the sun. In Plotinus's um, imagery of the one, it's the great chain of being which flows down from the one to the many. Although these, of course, are just images, and they're not really directional if you ask Plotinus straight. But yeah, they certainly evolved for natural reasons and for sociological, often patriarchal reasons, and they're metaphors which are important to understand their context, and also important to sometimes contest and balance with other modes and models and metaphors. It's important to remember as well that in the end of the day, they're all just maps, and maps are not the terrain. They're all just fingers pointing at the moon. They're not the moon itself, as the
Right.
Buddhist aphorism goes. And we have to understand how these images, these stories, these narratives, these metaphors, how they're helpful, when they're helpful, and we have to understand when they're not being helpful and when they need to be curtailed and balanced. But we have to always remember that they're never the moon itself.
That makes sense. The representation isn't the thing.
Correct.
Uh, um, and like, it almost sounds very Taoistic the way you're conceptualizing, like my question. It makes sense. That's actually, I appreciate that about like uh, Taoism specifically. That it's very like focuses on a more feminine conception, and it's around you. It's everywhere. Um, and I'm sure you know what I mean. And I was like, it brought up another good point to me that I wondered, which was like that first line, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. And I
Right.
was just curious, like, how do you think that applies to like people mistaking the representations as the things themselves? Do you think that that's like what they're talking about, or like where do you think the line is where like people might obfuscate or distort what like something means by saying that it can't be eternal versus like it's saying like pointing to the fact that it's a representation and not the thing itself. I
Yeah.
was curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really exquisite line from the literature of philosophical mysticism, and it's been translated in various ways which carry similar and related connotations. But I think it points to a really fundamental human experience in regards to our perception of reality, particularly in the domain that we've come to call in the West the mystical. And what it speaks to is the fact that there is the capacity for humans to experience reality in ways that are radically other than our everyday waking dualistic consciousness. And that experience of reality is one which is sacred, or at least feels sacred. It's imbued often with awe, sometimes with this mysterium tremendum, with this tremendous mystery. It's sometimes terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that it certainly is ineffable. It's impossible for us to really put into language, because language itself is built on the categories of dualism, of separation, of separating, and the reality itself that we experience is beyond all separation.
Mm-hmm.
One of William James's famous 4 points of mysticism is an ineffability, and I think simply what happens, without being too fancy, is that
Mm-hmm.
reality as it is beyond the capacity of speech and language to wrap its words around, and we humans encounter and experience that reality because we're part of it, and we continue to experience that reality. That hasn't happened, that hasn't stopped occurring, and we try to find ways to language it, to put it into words, and that's an important process, because that reality feels really salient and really important.
Mm-hmm.
It feels onto-normative. It feels more real than our everyday reality, is what people say when they come out of those encounters with reality unfiltered. And we want to pass that on. We want to live in alignment with it, and we want to create the laws and constitutions and practices and rituals and hymns to keep us in relationship with that state of being, with that dream that we've awakened from.
Mm-hmm.
And in the mystics, you know, ferocious attempt to try and record that fleeting glimpse of reality, that lightning flash in the dark forest, they give words to it. They give it names. They call it the Tao. They call it the Eternal. They call it Yud Kei Vav Kei. They call it Allah. They call it God, and they try to find ways to contain it. Salman Rushdie says that the work, the single work of literature, art, poetry, music, is to try and give language to that which is ineffable and passing. It's transient. James's other note of the mystical.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, of naming the nameless, it's a bizarre thing, because we both, it is our attempt to perpetuate it, and to harbor it into to pull it into the harbor of time, I think, is the language that Martin Buber uses in
Mm-hmm.
the opening to his ecstatic confessions. And in that, it's a double-edged sword, because there's a great tragedy in that, because we can cause a situation where we confuse the signifier with the signified, the map with the terrain. But on the other hand, it's the price we pay when we try to communicate that. And there's a responsibility to communicate that. The mystics, although they encounter the ineffable, they don't stop speaking. They can't shut up for a second about their experience,
Right.
which is the irony. So I think we just have to appreciate the playfulness of reality in that way, that we must speak about it. Yes, yet we cannot speak about it. And that's really that's the play at hand in some ways.
Right. That makes sense. And uh, I just wonder, like, sometimes I wonder where the line is. I was curious where you stood on it. Uh, and like, do you think that, like, something like meditation? I watched one of your videos recently about Jewish meditation. I'm sure you've done many others on different meditation styles, and I was curious what role you thought meditation plays in, like, helping people realize where that line is, whether it's like the intellectual meditation or like the clearing of the mind
Yeah,
style of meditation.
yeah. I think meditation plays a huge role in many mystical traditions, precisely because, for the two reasons that we mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
in that meditation allows us to clear the space to hear the silence, and only in that silence can we hear the voice of God, can we hear reality, fresh and speaking to us. And sometimes when we get too busy, we get too noisy, we stop to hear our own heartbeat. We stop to hear the divine speaking to us, and that's one thing. And the other thing, that meditation simply is sitting in the presence of being without doing anything, but just sitting there with being itself. And in Buddhism, that's a very important part of the tradition. In
Mm-hmm.
my own tradition, the emphasis, I mean, and there's many different forms of meditation, of course. In my own tradition, the emphasis was more on what we would call contemplation, that we're supposed to actually be thinking about specific ideas and trying to make them real to us through sitting on them and chewing them over and internalizing them. Um, some traditions do it in the form of mantra. Some traditions do it in the form of, vocalizing one's practice. Sometimes traditions do it in visualizations, trying to picture letters and colors. Sometimes it involves the body in different forms of movement and dance. But I think ultimately, for many, if not all of these traditions, it's about creating a life itself, which is meditative, which is contemplative,
Mm,
which is prayerful. It's not about stepping away from life to engage in our mystical practice of meditation or fill in the blank. It's about how do we find ways to live more meditatively, more presently, more consciously, more kindly, more prayerfully.
mm.
And I think ultimately that's where the traditions are often pointing to.
I agree with that for sure. I wonder what you think, like, do you feel like a lot of the infrastructure and culture of like modern society and like also past societies, depending on which one, have sort of made it difficult for people to really engage in that kind of life without sacrificing like their attachments to like the world? Like I feel like a lot of people have a hard time relating or even starting with something like that, um, because they have stuff they need to do. The barriers to getting into that kind of life might seem insurmountable. What do you think?
Yeah, I think certainly it has been challenging throughout history. It continues to be challenging. But what does Spinoza write at the end of these ethics? That anything anything good is as rare as it is worthy of pursuit, or something to that effect.
Mm,
That it's certainly not easy, and society is a projection of our own minds at large. Our collective mind,
hmm.
and our minds are busy and noisy and filled with doubt and questions and anger and guilt and animosity and suspicion. Like our minds are sometimes some really the monkey mind, as it's called in Buddhism, is really they're really nasty places, and society can be a reflection of our collective mind. And it's hard. It's hard to step away from those things. It's hard to step away from the temptations, from the attractions, from the neuroses of
Mm,
our minds and society, which is the mind at large. But I think the opportunity is always there, and it's always been there throughout history for people to step out, to step away, to step inside. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go off to the mountains and become monks and mystics, although that may not be a bad thing to do, at least for a bit of time, to center oneself. But I think what's more important is about finding ways to integrate that into our real lives, into our everyday lives, into the
mm,
real world. The tradition of Jewish mysticism has a very strong anti-monastic streak, where
mm,
where we didn't encourage celibacy. We didn't encourage people to escape. There were times for it. There were times where we encouraged it, and when we mandated it, in part. But largely the idea has been, throughout almost all of Jewish history and continuing into Hasidic mysticism, that it's about finding and bringing godliness into our mundane, into our busy lives, about sanctifying the ordinary. Um, and and in that sense, it's not far beyond us. It's not up a mountain that someone has to climb up and get it for us. It's not across the sea that someone needs to cross the ocean and bring it back for us. But it is here. It's close to us in our hearts and in our minds, that at any moment we can do it. And yeah, not to minimize the challenge of it, but I think that if it's true and if it's reality, then reality is always present and should always be attainable. Um, it may come at a price, but it's a price which is well worth it. They
mm.
asked the Buddha, what did he gain from all of his years of meditating? He gave up a lot, right? He was a prince according to Buddhist tradition. He
Right.
had all the riches, all the women, all the food, all the comfort, and he said, "You know what? I didn't gain anything through meditating, but I lost a lot of things." And they thought he was going to enumerate all of the material things that he lost, and he said, "No, I lost lust and anger and jealousy and pride and envy
Mm.
and and torment and guilt and you know all the things that become our shackles." And there's a lot to lose. We have a lot to lose, a lot worth losing, a lot that we should lose, and we could be living much freer lives as a result of losing those things.
That makes sense. And uh, it makes me curious as well. Like you have so many like different traditions you're well versed in. And like I don't know if anyone's ever asked you this before, but is there any like aspect of like a set of traditions or a particular tradition that really doesn't resonate with you? Like is there something that you like, because everyone has their own taste, you know? It's like
Right.
I was just curious, like uh Like, is there any part of like just any particular part of a religion that like really is hard for you to like digest, I guess?
Right. It's a good question. There are many parts of religion, of other religions, which are very foreign to me.
Right.
Or they feel very foreign, and they could be kind of scary before we get to know them. But I think that's just, a fear of the unknown. And once we get
Mm,
to see it, who is it? Um, Lucretius of Cicerus, who said, "I'm human, and therefore nothing human is foreign for me." That once we can see the
mm.
humanity in it, we can see that it's not foreign from us. There's one tradition. It's not quite a religion, but it's a tradition which I've been vocal in criticizing. That
Mm,
that falls in sort of the history of mysticism, which is
okay.
which is a tradition known as traditionalism.
Oh, tradition.
Yeah, yeah. And I am critical of it, and I haven't held back my criticism. I
Mm,
think it takes mysticism in a direction that is often
mm,
elitist, supreme, sometimes even hateful, racist, bigoted,
mm,
and I don't particularly like it.
right,
I don't think that I'm straw manning it. I think that I've given it its chance, and I've sat with the literature, and I think that there is what of value amongst the thought and thinking and literature of the traditionalists. But many of the
same.
directions that it takes, I'm simply not a fan of. I'm not a fan of its antipathy towards modernity. I think modernity is filled with possibility of divinity, and not something that is simply darkness. I don't like the way that it sees women. I don't like the way that it sees people that aren't white. There's like I don't want to paint all
Right,
the traditionalists in one
sure.
sort of broad stroke, because there are amongst the traditionalists, there are those that have formulated better positions. For example, Houston Smith is a traditionalist who I'm very much taken by, and I think his work on mysticism is on religion, of course, is very good, but on mysticism is particularly good.
Mm,
But maybe without saying names, there are, and people who know, there are a handful of traditionalists who I think do a disjustice to mysticism. I think that mysticism at the end of the day has to be about love, and I think that often I don't see that in that tradition. Um, and it's important. It's like part of I could have
right.
answered this by saying, "Hey, I'm actually not going to talk about things I don't like. We could just talk about things that we love." But there is a place. There is a place. There's a verse in the book of Psalms which says, "Ohavei Hashem sinura," those that love God, those that love reality,
Yeah.
despise injustice and despise evil. And I'm not going to go so far as to call it evil, but I think that it misses the mark. And I think that as lovers of wisdom, lovers of truth, lovers of beauty, lovers of love, we have to with love we have to call out the things that are misrepresenting our traditions when we see them.
I agree with you, actually. I mean, we can't always talk about the things we like. We can make the difficult conversations
Absolutely.
even more pleasant if we accept them as they
Yes.
are. Like, it's, I mean, I'm sure that from your channel and your experiences and beliefs that you've faced pushback in various ways that are personal, that's difficult to deal with. And I mean, I don't want to get into that, obviously, because I don't want to, you know what I mean. But I feel like a meta mystics probably have a universal experience with that. Actually, I think that that's something people who watch your content and are interested in mysticism have faced, regardless of their tradition, of their home tradition. Wouldn't you agree? Like that it's sort of a universal meta mystic uh, experience.
Yeah, I think that I mean I've being putting myself out there publicly comes with the invitation to derision and criticism, and sometimes more constructive and sometimes not constructive at all. And that's fine. It doesn't bother me. Like I don't take it to heart.
Right,
But I think that there is a sense where when moving into the meta, as you're saying, people within the tradition itself can feel abandoned, can feel betrayed, can feel like, oh, you're no longer one of us, or speaking, within the community. You're trying to get beyond us. You're trying to, and I'm very much of the belief that that's not the case. That that
right.
that that moving to a place of metamysticism is not an abandonment of our particularism. I think that's a big mistake, and I try to I mean I know that for myself in a very deep way, and I try to be vocal about that, and to be both visually and auditorially, to to show up as a proud Jew, as a proud Jewish mystic, whatever that means, and as a proud Chasid, I'm very much committed to my specific lineage, my specific Rebbe, my specific texts and practices, and I don't hide them at all. I make them. They're actually very front and center. I'm making a video now on the way that birthdays are celebrated according to Hasidic mysticism, for an upcoming birthday of mine. So it's something which I feel very. I have received criticism for it. I think there's also something in that when we try to I think there's a need for religious and spiritual autonomy and independence and agency. And when we try to claim that for ourselves, it can feel threatening to others.
Right.
It can call their own beliefs and practices into question. And I can see that happening. And I think we have to do it with gentleness and with delicacy, and we have to be thoughtful about it, the way that we do that. Because we don't want to be alienating people in the process. We want to be bringing people along for the ride and trying to show them a bigger picture.
Well, that's awesome. I respect that you've like integrated, is, you said earlier, integrated the parts of your upbringing and your lineage into who you are without letting it hold you back from exploring what you think is important with the Meta-Mysticism. And I was curious, what role does your mentor, your rabbi that taught you, like what role does he still play in your mind and in your thinking that set you out on this journey of exploration?
Yeah. Firstly, not only is it like not contrary to the way I've been raised, I think that it's a direct outflow of the way I've been raised and the way I've been taught. I think it's not that, it may be unique in the way that I've experienced and interpreted it, but I think it follows the particularism directly. The Rebbe's mission was a global mission, and the Rebbe was the one who told us that this was the last generation of exile and the first generation of redemption. And the Rebbe played that role for us and showed us, not just by playing the role, but by demonstrating how we ourselves can and had to step into that position to begin to think globally. They say act local, think global. And the Rebbe was a very strong leader and example of that way of living. And I think that, the Rebbe would often cite the Rebbe came from a lineage of spiritual leaders, going back 7 generations, the first leader of the Chabad movement, and going back 2 generations earlier to the beginning of the Hasidic movement, to the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem, we don't have much of his own writings. We have a lot of teachings that his students recorded, but one of the few things that we have from his own hand, or so it seems, is a letter that he wrote to his brother-in-law, Gershon Kittever. And he writes to his brother-in-law about a vision that he had, what's known in Jewish mysticism as a ascent of the soul, aliyat neshama, a state of, we could say in today's jargon, of elevated consciousness, or an altered state of consciousness, in which he encountered the Messiah, the spirit of the Messiah. And in this vision, he asks the Messiah a famous Talmudic question that's asked the Messiah thousands of years before, Eimatai ka'atimar, when is the Master coming? And the Messiah answered the Baal Shem Tov, when your teachings are spread out, when your wellsprings, when your waters are spread out across the whole world. And the Rebbe, my Rebbe, was very much a vocal successor and progenitor of that responsibility to take the teachings of mysticism, of Hasidut, and to spread them out to the entire world. And spreading them to the entire world doesn't mean just to Jews all around the world, but means that the entire world, Jew and non-Jew alike, have the capacity and therefore the obligation to realize the true state of reality, which is one which is only divine and not separated. So my work of going and trying to take mysticism and move it from the particular to the meta, and articulate it in a way that can be heard and accessible to hopefully anyone and everyone, to me is a prerequisite for the Messianic age, and is the very teaching which my mentor, my spiritual leader, my spiritual father taught, and it's someone with whom I have a very deep and intimate relationship. It's perhaps perhaps the most intimate relationship in my life, and a person whose call and charge I face and grapple with and hear every day of my life.
That's very deep, and thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. I was thinking, like, so taking that Chasid like background and goals of like in relate, how does that, like, with your friends who run the other mysticism channels like Esoterica and those, like, do you believe that like there's some sort of like shared like union in that, like, goal, or like how do you think that relates and interlocks with the meta-mysticism, the specifics and particulars of the Hasid goals and history, and how does that become like a shared vision with people who may have different histories that they identify with? I was curious what you. It's a difficult question. I was just.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's I mean, it's something that my very dear friends and colleagues, the religious studies educators on YouTube,
Yeah.
that's something that we've discussed both extensively in private and also to some lesser degree, but also available in public. We've done dialogues together on the veracity of mysticism, on the logic of mysticism, on perennialism, on these various forms, and God willing, we will continue to have those discussions, and we have some planned to continue to come for the future. I will say that each one of us comes from a very rich, diverse difference of backgrounds and perspectives, and we not only respect each other's differences and diversity, but we cherish the differences between us. And it's precisely those differences that allow something beautiful to flourish, that can be thoughtful and critical and respectful and loving in that dialogue forward. I think that to some degree, I might be the most sort of vocal in identifying as a perennialist, or as this meta-mysticism, as we're calling it here.
Yeah.
Philip, my good friend from Let's Talk Religion, in discussions that we've had around it, is shared his both partiality and suspicion towards perennialism, and that's something that he's discussed on his channel as well. I think he's discussed it in his fantastic, brilliant video on Ibn Arabi, on Wahdat al-Wujud, on the unity of being in Sufism. I think it's a metaphysic which Philip is very open to, and I think that's something that he admits himself publicly. I'm not here to speak on his behalf. He's a very eloquent speaker, and he'll speak for himself. But
I'm sure.
yeah, and in other ways, Justin and I, a very dear friend and colleague and mentor, have agreed and disagreed over questions of perennialism and meta-mysticism and traditionalism. I think in many ways, there, despite our real differences of background, and the same for Dr. Angela Puka, despite our very real differences of background and training and upraising, we have, I think, a lot more in common in the way that we approach these questions than we have differences. And those differences may be pronounced for the important sake of defining where the differences do stand, which is important work. But I think that beneath it, there's a tremendous amount of commonality, and also I do think that the goal is not for us to become one homogenous, agreeing group. I think
Right.
each remain, as the goal it is for I think humanity as a whole and for religions as a whole, to remain independent, to remain separate, to remain different, to remain differing, and yet find the capacity for deep, loving commonality and shared vision and purpose, and that we certainly have. And in that sense, I feel very blessed and lucky to be part of that microcosm of what it is that at least I'm striving for, and I think they are as well.
Well, that's good. It makes gives me hope at least that uh, people who are well known and well versed, such as the group of religious studies YouTubers that you guys, I don't know if you guys have an official name as a group or something. I don't know, but
We
I
have
do
been
feel
named. We've been named Religion Tube. That's the name that we've been given.
good. Well, I think it's great. It gives me inspiration, at least that at least people can get along, especially in such an intellectual form. I mean, you look back at all the like, the whole left-right dichotomy comes from the Hegelians that could never get along.
Yeah,
Like there's so many different traditions, even within one tradition,
yeah,
where people can't get along, and it leads to problems, let
yeah.
alone like in various ones.
Yeah, I think it's not just that we get alone. It's that not just that we get along. It's that we've developed a deeply kind, caring, supportive, loving community amongst ourselves,
Hmm.
which is really tremendous in the way that it exemplifies the values which many of us are trying to highlight in religion, whether or not we're religious practitioners ourselves or not. But really, those values do shine through, and I feel really honored and yeah, I don't think I'd be able to do my work at all continuing till today without the deep friendship and support and care from my colleagues and friends.
That's fantastic. It's it gives me hope. That's all I'm saying, and it makes me wonder about like um you know, you how you mentioned about traditionalism in the sort of on the other end you have the meta mystics, like there's sort of totally different orientations towards like viewing like structures of like intellectual life and probably as well like just how people view laws and how they view authority. And I just wonder like psychologically, do you think like that the meta mystic like sort of I like the awareness, um how do you think that impacts you when you're interpreting some sort of uh and how do you think through it in a like not any particular idea, but what's your thought process when you're reading something, maybe something you've never read? How do you like synthesize like authority and like how does it connect to you?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's something which would obviously differ, from text to text depending on what's being read.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that let's say when I'm reading a religious text, which has its own strong particularisms, which religions tend to have, or even a mystical
Mm-hmm.
text, which are hyper particular. I try to begin with the understanding. Um, I mean, there's also room to read a text on its own and not to be imposing our models and schemas upon it, which is an important process when reading a text. But
Right.
when I am trying to read it from the perspective of metamysticism, what I'm trying to remember and understand is that which we've been laying out here all along, is that there is there is reality, and the true nature of reality is that reality is one, is interdependent and interconnected, and is
Mm-hmm.
not internally isolated or separated or dual or multiple, and that is the truth of reality, and the encounter of that is what the mystics are trying to speak about, each in their own language and their own tongue, and it finds its way into particular expression, and that part of the
Mm-hmm.
work of trying to read it through a metamystical lens is to retranslate that back into its global context. And global context means both moving it away, or translating it into a universal expression, and also understanding its historical
Mm-hmm.
place in that tradition. So when we read a text from the Middle Ages, we have to understand how that's being influenced by the schools of thought that are streaming in from the East and from the West, and from the Neoplatonic thinkers, and from the Islamic thinkers, and so I would say it's both a grounding that in a universal language, in a universal metaphysic, and in a universal
Mhm.
history, to understand how this text comes to be, and through that process we can take texts that are hyper particular and begin to understand what they may mean in a global historical context, what they may mean even for us today in 2024, and we
Mhm.
can begin that process of universalizing, of psychologizing, of abstracting, um, without needing to ever do. We don't want to do violence to the text. We don't want to impose something in the text that's not being spoken there. I think
Right.
that would be a mistake. But we can, through a very, and this is really just a impressionistic methodology here. There's a lot
Right.
more that needs to go into it. But at the very least of trying to find a way that we can see how we're speaking to a shared universal truth beyond our particular language.
That's I can see that. That makes sense. And on a little slightly different note, I was curious, what what's something you've learned in like the past month or few months that's like totally like blown you away? I don't know. Is there something like insane that's happened to you, like some experience where you felt outside your body or something that changed your perspective, whatever it is? I was I was curious, like if you had any like changes in perspective on a fundamental level that really shook you up a little.
Right, that's a good question. I feel grateful to say that I've felt mostly inside my body, which is a good place to be. Um, yeah, I think sort of a broader shift. I've kind of been moving around geographically. I was living in Jerusalem. I'm now in
Yeah.
the States, and I've kind of been looking for community and nature, and I've there's a sense in myself of like having a pining, a knowing to where I want to be and how I want to be, and trying to you know
Hmm.
flex my agency in life to move towards those places, and not always succeeding, and sort of the journey of being okay with the journey itself, and hope, and knowing that if we have the patience and the optimism and the tenacity, we can get to the place where we'd like to be. um and it's a sort of a slow journey, and it's sometimes feels like two steps forward, one step backwards. But
Mm.
yeah, I don't think there's been any particular moments of epiphany,
Okay.
just the slow work of maintaining my physical health, my mental health, and my spiritual health, and trying to be in the places that I want to be, surrounded by the people that I want to be surrounded by, and doing the work that I love doing. um yeah, a bit of a boring answer, but
Hey, that's
life
okay.
as an adult is sometimes boring.
Well, it's your truth, that's valid to me,
I
I
appreciate it.
just I don't know. I sometimes I wonder, people go about their daily life and stuff, and then out of nowhere something happens and they don't tell anyone because no one asks. But
I think it's certainly the case. I think they probably the tendency is that people, when something like that happens, people they tend to inform people about it. They don't need to be asked about it. They go out, they they become a bit proselytic around it. But perhaps people need to be asked.